Chapter 2. But in her mind was established now a vague uneasiness, though so vague that at first she did not recognize it. Her thought would suddenly pause. Now what is it? She would ask herself. Something's on my mind. What is it I've forgotten? The picture of her first-floor lodger appeared, and she knew at once. Oh yes, it's that mirror and the diagrams, of course. Some taut wire of alarm was quivering at the back of her mind. It was akin to those childhood alarms that pertain to the big unexplained mysteries no parent can elucidate because no parent knows. Only God can tell that, says the parent, evading the insoluble problem. I'd better not think about it, was the analogous conclusion reached by Miss Speke. Meanwhile, the impression the new lodger's personality made upon her mind perceptibly deepened. He seemed to her full of power, above little things, a man of intense and mysterious mental life. He was constantly and somewhat possessingly in her thoughts. The mere thought of him, she found, stimulated her. It was just before luncheon, as she returned from her morning marketing, that the servant drew her attention to certain marks upon the carpet of Mr. Thorley's sitting room. She had discovered them as she handled the vacuum cleaner, faint, short lines drawn by dark chalk or crayons, in shape like the top or bottom right angle of a square bracket, and sometimes with a tiny arrow shown as well. There were occasional other marks, too, that Miss Speke recognized as the hieroglyphics she called squiggles. Mistress and servant examined them together in a stooping position. They found others on the bedroom carpet, too, only these were not straight. They were small curved lines, and about the feet of the full-length mirror they clustered in a quantity, segments of circles, some large, some small. They looked as if someone had snipped off curly hair, or pared his fingernails with sharp scissors, only considerably larger, and they were so faint that they were only visible when the sunlight fell upon them. I knew they was drawn on, said Sarah, puzzled, yet proud that she had found them, because they didn't come up with the dust and fluff. I'll speak to Mr. Thorley, was the only comment Miss Speke made. I'll tell him. Her voice was not quite steady, but the girl apparently noticed nothing. There's all this, too, please, Mum. She pointed to a number of fine silk threads she had collected upon a bit of newspaper, preparatory to the dustbin. They were stuck on the cupboard door and the walls, stretched all across the room, but rather high up. I only saw them by chance. One caught on my face. Miss Speke stared, touched, examined for some seconds without speaking. She remembered the thread that had tickled her own cheek. She looked inquiringly round the room, and the servant, following her suggestion, indicated where the threads had been attached to walls and furniture. No marks, however, were left. There was no damage done. I'll mention it to Mr. Thorley, said her mistress briefly, unwilling to discuss the matter with the new servant, much less to admit that she was uncomfortably at sea. Mr. Thorley, she added, as though there was nothing unusual, is a high mathematician. He makes measurements and calculations of that sort. She had not sufficient control of her voice to be more explicit, and she went from the room, aware that, unaccountably, she was trembling. She had first gathered up the threads, meaning to show them to her lodger when she demanded an explanation, but the explanation was delayed, for, to state it bluntly, she was afraid to ask him for it. She put it off till the following morning, then till the day after, and finally she decided to say nothing about the matter at all. I'd better leave it, perhaps, after all, she persuaded herself. There's no damage done, anyhow. I'd better not inquire. All the same, she did not like it. By the end of the week, however, she was able to pride herself upon her restraint and tact. The marks on the carpet, rubbed out by the girl, were not renewed, and the fine threads of silk were never again found stretching through the air from wall to furniture. Mr. Thorley had evidently noticed their removal and had discontinued what he had observed was an undesirable performance. He was a scholar and a gentleman, but he was more. He was frank and straight-dealing. One morning he asked to see his landlady and told her all about it himself. "Oh," he said in his pleasantest, easiest manner when she came into the room, "I wanted to tell you, Miss Speke, indeed I meant to do so long before this, about the marks I made on your carpets." He smiled apologetically, "and the silk threads I stretched. I used them for measurements. For problems I set my pupils, and one morning I left them there by mistake. The marks easily rub out, but I will use scraps of paper instead another time. I can pin these on, if you will kindly tell your excellent servant not to touch them. They're rather important to me." He smiled again charmingly, and his face wore the wistful, rather yearning expression that had already appealed to her. The eyes, it struck her, were very brilliant. "Any damage," he added, "though I assure you none is possible really, I would of course make good to you, Miss Speke." "Thank you, Mr. Thorley," was all Miss Speke could find to say, so confused was her mind by troubling thoughts and questions she dared not express. "Of course, this is my best suite, you see." It was all most amicable and pleasant between them. "I wonder, have my books come?" he asked as he went out. "Ah, there they are, I do believe," he exclaimed, for through the open front door a van was seen discharging a very large packing case. "Your books, Mr. Thorley," Miss Speke murmured, noting the size of the package with dismay. "But I'm afraid you'll hardly find space to put them in," she stammered. "The rooms, she did not wish to disparage them, "are so small, aren't they?" Mr. Thorley smiled delightfully. "Oh, please do not trouble on that account," he said. "I shall find space all right, I assure you. It's merely a question of knowing where and how to put them." And he proceeded to give the men instructions. A few days later, a second case arrived. "I'm expecting some instruments, too," he mentioned casually, "mathematical instruments." And he again assured her, with his confident smile, that she need have no anxiety on the score of space. Nor would he dent the walls or scrape the furniture the least little bit. There was always room, he reminded her gently again, provided one knew how to stow things away. Both books and instruments were necessary to his work. Miss Speke need feel no anxiety at all. But Miss Speke felt more than anxiety. She felt uneasiness. She felt a singular growing dread. There lay in her a seed of distress that began to sprout rapidly. Everything arrived as Mr. Thorley has announced. Case upon case was unpacked in his room by his own hands. The straw and wood she used for firing purposes. There was no mess, no litter, no untidiness, nor were walls or furniture injured in any way. What caused her dread to deepen into something bordering upon actual alarm was the fact that, on searching Mr. Thorley's rooms when he was out, she could discover no trace of any of the things that had arrived. There was no sign of either books or instruments. Where had he stored them? Where could they lie concealed? She asked herself innumerable questions, but found no answer to them. These stores, enough to choke and block the room, had been brought in through the sitting-room door. They could not possibly have been taken out again. They had not been taken out. Yet no trace of them was anywhere to be seen. It was very strange, she thought. Indeed, it was more than strange. She felt excited. She felt a touch of hysterical alarm. Meanwhile, thin strips of white paper, straight, angled, curved, were pinned upon the carpet. Threads of finest silk again stretched overhead, connecting the top of the door lintel with the window, the high cupboard with the curtain rods, yet too high to be brushed away merely by the head of anyone moving in the room, and the full-length mirror still stood with its face close against the wall. The mystery of these aerial entanglements increased Miss Speke's alarm considerably. What could their purpose be? Thank God, she thought, this isn't wartime. She knew enough to realize their meaning was not wireless, that they bore some relation to the lines on the carpet and to the diagrams and curves upon the paper she grasped vaguely. But what it all meant baffled her and made her feel quite stupid. Where all the books and instruments had disappeared added to her bewilderment. She felt more and more perturbed. A vague, uncertain fear was worse than something definite she could face and deal with. Her fear increased. Then, suddenly, yet with a reasonable enough excuse, Sarah gave notice. For some reason, Miss Speke did not argue with the girl. She preferred to let the real meaning of her leaving remain unexpressed. She just let her go. But the fact disturbed her extraordinarily. Sarah had been given every satisfaction. There had been no sign of a grievance, no complaint. The work was not hard. The pay was good. It was simply that the girl preferred to leave. Miss Speke attributed it to Mr. Thorley. She became more and more disturbed in mind. Also, she found herself more and more avoiding her lodger, whose regular habits made such avoidance an easy matter. Knowing his hours of exit and entrance, she took care to be out of the way. At the mere sound of his step, she flew to cover. The new servant, a stupid yet not inefficient country girl, betrayed no reaction of any sort, no unfavorable reaction at any rate. Having received her instructions, Lizzie did her work without complaint from either side. She did not remove the paper and the thread, nor did she mention them. She seemed just the country clod she was. Miss Speke, however, began to have restless nights. She contracted an unpleasant habit. She lay awake listening.